OODA. The OODA loop is a concept that I never heard of in the military. And I came across it actually through agile software development. I think probably the route was roughly reading General Stanley McChrystal's Team of Teams, from there finding Cynefin, from Cynefin finding Wardley maps, and from Wardley maps finding OODA. And from finding OODA to becoming borderline obsessed. Well, no, not borderline, very obsessed with it. So this talk is to try and basically contextualize some of the things that I've learned over the last few years, mashed up with some of the things that I realized about my military service that I discounted for a long time. And yeah, let's dive in. So rough structure then, I'll give a brief intro, a bit of a backstory, talk about the goals of the talk about the origins of the OODA loop, because I think it's quite important to consider the context of where things come from. I'll talk about some of the recent explorations that Chris, who's just joined the call, has also been part of, and I'll share a playlist that includes those 3 hours of OODA loop conversation, which go pretty deep, like probably the deepest down the rabbit hole that I've been thus far. Bit of context about why I think it's important now, and then a little bit about where I hope this work will go. So, bit of a backstory on me then. So I, as Barry mentioned, I was in the Royal Marines from 2000 to 2004. I wasn't a programmer before I joined, but I was lucky enough to get very bored on a ship in 2003 on the way to Iraq and order a couple of books to be delivered to me, one on Python, one on Linux. And by the time I got back to the UK, I knew the basics of programming. And that was the kind of the beginnings of my tech career, essentially. For a long time after I left the military, I pretty much discounted my time in the military, to be honest. I thought, it's a fun diversion that I did when I was in my early 20s. Now I'm a computer nerd. Now I write code. There's not really much crossover. And that was the case for probably 10 years. And that 10 years encompassed working in investment banks, working in hedge funds, startups. And then I started to move into leadership. And I think probably 2014 or so, start to notice some real shifts in the tech landscape. When I first got into tech, launching a tech company consisted of buying physical servers, consisted of, taking 6 months to get an MVP up and running and launch it. And, none of what we kind of take for granted now was in existence. So the stuff that you could do now in probably a week would have taken you 6 months and, a very large amount of money. And so, I did all the right stuff. I read all the stuff about lean startup and agile books and Kanban and all of these things. It wasn't really working for me, if I'm honest. The world started moving a bit too quickly. So that sort of, reading Team of Teams back in 2015, I guess, 2014, 2015, 2017. And then a couple of other books that were military derived made me realize that actually there's quite a bit of knowledge and experience that I had from the military that I'd really not realized the benefit of, which led me on a journey to discover as much as I could. So goals for this talk, I want to explain the OODA loop from the perspective of somebody working in the tech industry. So if you're in a scaling startup, which I realize is probably not many of us, I've worked in scaling tech startups, and they are pretty chaotic places. Lots of stuff lying around, lots of change. Nobody really knows what's going on. In most cases, but they're the ones that are changing our industry. They're the ones that are launching things that we then use to build the next generation faster and faster. So even if you're not in that environment, you still need to deal with competitors and changes that are driven by that environment. So, if you're not in a scaling tech startup, hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll have a bit of a mental model for how to think about and deal with the changes in the ecosystem that we see and the changes in our teams that you see. So first off, let's deal with what the OODA loop is not. The OODA loop is not this very simplified model, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. This is the way we almost always come across it. This is the way I first came across the OODA loop. And it's useful because if you've never heard of OODA, this is it's not wrong. But this diagram is quite problematic because it's very easy to grasp onto, and it's very easy to think that you're looking at some kind of linear process, and that you just go through this cycle. And the simplistic explanation of OODA is that those who move through this cycle quicker have a faster feedback loop and they win, right? And it's not wrong, but it's not really the full story. Because this chap who came up with the OODA loop, he didn't just come up with the OODA loop. The OODA loop, then the diagram that I'll show you in the next slide, was the culmination of probably, 40 years of work, I should think. Starting in the 1950s when he was a fighter pilot, he wanted to figure out how come the American planes were winning in Korea at the rate that they were. Led him to go back to university and get an engineering degree, learn about thermodynamics so he could write the aerial attack study. He wrote a little paper called Destruction and Creation, which is about the kind of mental patterns that we go through to orient to our environment. And then he wrote Patterns of Conflict and a Discourse on Winning and Losing, which I say wrote. He didn't actually write a huge amount down. A lot of our wisdom is passed, or a lot of what we know about Boyd is passed down from his compatriots, the people that he worked with, and from videos, very grainy kind of VHS type footage of him delivering a discourse on winning and losing, which I think was like a 6-hour lecture by the time he was done. Boyd cut an absolute, a path through military doctrine and military strategy that's pretty much unparalleled in recent years, certainly. He was responsible for the strategy in the first Gulf War. And the OODA loop is really, I think, the OODA loop is actually something that he was poked and prodded and he said, all right, fine. It looks like this. This is what the OODA loop is. Right. This was his diagram that he drew. And, I think he drew this in probably mid to late 90s. So shortly before he passed away. And, this was, bearing in mind, this was the time of overhead projectors and crayons as a medium for expression. This is the best that he could come up with to explain his 30 years of work. So, it's not that surprising that this kind of gets misrepresented and misunderstood. So I'll skip over it a little bit. I'm going to talk about the diagram, but we go from that very linear circular diagram to something that incorporates feedback and feed forward mechanisms. So these are important because every stage through the OODA loop, you're always taking in extra information. So there's a bit of a conversation rumbling on about whether OODA is an open or closed system. I'm of the belief that it's an open system that essentially determines how an entity shapes and is shaped by its environment. So taking it from observation, we've got outside information, we've got continual unfolding effects of our actions on the environment and circumstances beyond our control that unfold. Those all feed into our existing mental models. So our existing ideas about the world, our existing experience, all of those things comprise our orientation in the middle. Our orientation then has two implicit guidance and control loops, if you want, or pathways. One back to observation, so what we believe shapes what we see. And then we've got these forward mechanisms feed forward to decision. So we make a hypothesis, we make a decision, we take an action, and that both the decision and the action create more observation. So actually, I've got a slight issue with the top feedback mechanism here. So this one, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this top feedback line, I think that it should go through Orient, and I'll show you something that we've been working on later, which I hope makes it a bit clearer. But the other implicit guidance and control line is particularly interesting because it jumps straight over decision, straight to action. So this, for me, is really the most interesting part of OODA. This is where you've got intuition, and you've got such great team cohesion that nobody needs to make an explicit decision. So this is where I became really interested in the OODA loop, because this is what I remember from training in the Marines, and this is what I remember from working in a tight-knit team, both in the Marines and in when I used to work on the doors down in Portsmouth. And it's this that I think is most important, because that's the thing, making a decision takes time. And when you're operating in very changeable circumstances, that's time is money, time is energy. And very often you can't afford to take a large amount of time to go through this cycle because things are changing so quickly. So I think it's important to bear in mind the implicit guidance and control. And I think in the next slide after this one, it will become a bit clearer what I mean. So Boyd, the OODA loop has for me, it has three main pillars. And they're really, really grounded in, they're not grounded in military theory, they're grounded in science, and they're grounded in observations about reality. So the first one's entropy. Boyd covered a lot of thermodynamics when he went back to university to understand how aircraft interact in combat. And the second law of thermodynamics is really critical to the OODA loop. So if you consider, well, actually, I'll dig into what this means in a later part of the talk. The other thing is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So this determines the limits of our observation accuracy, right? So if we're in a very fast changing environment and the tempo with which we can sample that environment isn't as fast as the environment changes, we will observe erratic or unexplainable behavior, because we can't interoperate with that environment. It's moving too fast. And then the other big pillar is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So uncertainty and incompleteness, are having a bit of a resurgence nowadays in quantum mechanics and the impacts that study in those fields are having. But Gödel's incompleteness theorem is sort of halfway between maths and logic, I guess. And it pertains to the limits of our internal consistency. So if you have a system of logic, you can't describe that system of logic from within that system of logic. You have to step outside it. This is a bit kind of mind-bending, and I'm going to try and steer away from the metaphysical aspects of this until maybe in the discussion afterwards. But what this essentially means is that you can't really have a full picture of the environment, the internal environment that you're operating in. So if you're in a company or a team or an organization, there's a limit to the understanding that you can have of the internal structure of that thing, right? You can only have an understanding of that internal structure from an outside perspective, but by looking at that internal structure, you then sort of become part of it and you become entangled with it. I promise that's enough of the philosophy until anyone wants to chat about that in the discussion. So one of the things so Chris and I have been part of an exploration process, but I've been trying to explain the OODA loop better than the diagrams. Not better. Better is not really the right word. That sounds very hubristic. But I think the OODA loop suffers from a representation problem, right? It's the tools that we use to represent it are, have moved on in 20 years. So I think we've got better options now. So one of the things that I find useful, and this has come out of looking at sort of research into cognition, amongst other things. If we start thinking about the OODA loop, I mean, the OODA loop is a continual intertwined process, but if we start where we think about it, if we start it from action, right? So we don't take any action from the smallest to the largest without having an expectation of how that action turns out, right? And there's some interesting books and interesting studies into cognition. One is Surfing Uncertainty, another one's 1,000 Brains, and they say that basically there isn't any cognition without action, right? Even our vision, we can't have any sort of vision without moving our eyes, the tiny little eye movements. We can't feel things without moving our fingers. Like if you're sitting here like this, you can't actually feel anything until you start to move it. If you have something in your grasp, you can't feel it without having some action. So action sets an expectation. An expectation is a mental model that you have, that your brain builds, that shapes what you're expecting to happen, and that expectation then shapes your observation. So if you expect to see something, you're more likely to see it, whether it's happening or not, right? So this is where the human biases come in, confirmation bias, and all of the others. There's a big diagram that you can find on Wikipedia that has something like 200 human biases, and most of them will shape our observation in some way. So okay, so we've taken an action, and then we observe the outcomes of that action. And depending on how well our observations match what our expectations were, we'll have some surprise, right? Either it's going to match completely and we're like, yep, I know this like the back of my hand, I know exactly what's going to happen, and then the events play out exactly as you expect, and then there's no surprise. Or you're in an unfamiliar situation or something unusual has happened, and you're like, you get the kind of the oh shit moment, and nothing that you expected has actually come to pass, and you're now in very unfamiliar territory. So when you get that surprise, you've got two options. You can either reconfigure your internal mental models. You can say, oh, wow, I really got this wrong. Oops, I better take a step back and think about this. But, in reality, that's a very difficult thing to do, because it requires much more energy to kind of pull everything apart, look at it all individually, put it back together. You might still be wrong. And equally, if it's a bit of a fraught environment, that can be a bit of an ego hit sometimes as well, that people struggle with, and can be difficult to do that for a number of reasons. So what would normally happen is that that surprise will generate some kind of intention, and that intention is a natural kind of outcome of wanting the outside world to match up with our internal representation. If you're interested, then Carl Friston's free energy principle is probably a good place to look to understand a bit more about this. But what will normally happen is that our intention will trigger some kind of reaction to that surprise, right? So we'll either have a think about it as a team, make a decision, and take another action, or we'll do that implicit guidance and control thing that was in the other diagram, and we'll jump back, we'll take another action one way or another. That might go through decision, or it might just be something that's like, snap judgment, the shit's hit the fan, let's try this, right? There's going to be a broad spectrum, basically. So another representation that I've ended up playing with is that, if we've got situational awareness on the one side and execution on the other, what the OODA loop is a way that those two things can meet, right? So we have our awareness and our orientation, or observation and our orientation, which feed into ever deeper layers of orientation and changing that orientation. And then, so that's our inward pathway, information coming in from the environment. And then there's a energy going into the environment, which is where we're trying to change our circumstances, or we're trying to affect some kind of change in the direction that we want in the outside world, and that's our execution. So we can see that observation and intention flows towards the execution side, and when we take an action, expectation flows back round to the orientation side. So that's why I've started calling this the algorithm of adaptation. I've had, very valid pushback that algorithm is not really the right way to describe this, which I agree with. I haven't found a better word yet. So I'm using algorithm from the kind of the point of view of this is a process with underlying mechanics to it, right? Much as an algorithm in computer science is a studied phenomena that has steps. So there is an algorithm somewhere under this, right? The algorithm is the chemicals in our brain and how multiple people in a team coalesce together. So it is an algorithm, whether or not we can see it and sense it with today's tools. So another way of understanding this is that our actions, we pick one of a range of available actions, and by the time we experience the outcomes of those actions, so the execution flows into our experience, it's not possible to have this kind of linear, remember the circle, right? By the time we have an experience, it's not generally possible to say this was 100% the outcome of one action, even though our brains will fool us into thinking that, and we will try our utmost as humans to try and come up with simplistic explanations. It's really not possible to do that, right? Because our observations are, like ripples in a pond. This big bright part over here that we're seeing as a, from the point of view of this observer, we're seeing this as a high point, as many waves overlapping. But by the time that happens, it's actually impossible to really, categorically say that this cause was this effect. And I think this is probably the biggest problem that we have, both as individuals and as teams and organizations, is that we continually try and come up with this simple, we're pattern matching machines. We desperately want simple explanations. So often we try and manufacture those where they don't exist. And I think it's useful to be able to kind of think about things in this way, because it makes it clear that, the world isn't cause and effect. So that's where we were at with the kind of exploration so far. And I just want to, talk a bit about why I think this is so important. So the world that we live in, the tech industry, we tend to, and technologists actually, I'll put my hand up as guilty of this myself. Well, guilty is not really the right word, but anyway, technologists like to see things in a very kind of linear cause and effect fashion, right? We like to think of the entities in a system. We like to think that we can take things apart and put them back together again, and that in taking them apart and reducing them down to their individual components, we get a better understanding. We think of systems as things that need to be, built and then maintained. We're in the domain of experts. We're all of our industries kind of best practice or, wisdom is pointed towards people being efficient or companies being efficient, right? There's this continual drive for specialization and efficiency. And, that means that we've ended up with systems that are pretty fragile, right? It's as witnessed in the last few years with things like Brexit and pandemics and, all of these things that happen that are highly tuned, fragile systems can't really handle. And the reason that they struggle is because actually the world is complex rather than complicated. And this is, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Dave Snowden's work on the Cynefin framework, but I think this is the lens that I'm looking at this through, right? In the complex world, actually the complexity of a situation is driven by the connections rather than the entities, right? It's the way the entities relate to each other. In order to understand systems like that, we have to recognize that we can't understand the individual pieces. We can only try and move towards a holistic understanding of the system as a whole. Systems in this view are kind of self-sustaining ecosystems or organisms rather than machines that have been built. the people that guide us are explorers who understand that, you know, we're not looking for raw cause and effect here. That there's a nuance involved, and we have to be open to experimentation and open to being wrong, because we want to build systems that are effective. You know, efficiency is still important, but only in the small, right? The system overall has to be effective, and that generally means that it's less efficient. You know, there'll be redundancy, there'll be multiple different pathways, there'll be unexplained little things that happen, and that's effectiveness rather than efficiency. It's very important, and I think that's what helps us lead to resilient systems. And, you know, that's what society and business and companies in general need right now. It's resilience, so that, you know, we're not continually rocking back and forth with every little shock. Because, you know, the ultimate sort of pattern here is that, you know, we start out, we try something new. You know, we're in this kind of confused domain. We don't really understand what it is we're doing or what we're trying to do. We do it over and over, and, you know, the time passes and we extract a little bit of clarity from that, right? We now understand what it is. Maybe, you know, we understand the known unknowns, or we've got sort of conscious incompetence at this point. At that point, you know, once we've achieved some clarity, we can start to build in some consistency. And at this point, you know, we've moved a part of our domain into that kind of complicated, known, sort of linear, you know, we understand that doing this thing has this outcome. And this is the world of standard operating procedures and, you know, consistency. And consistency then allows us to scale things. But when we're scaling things, there are always new, emergent, confusing or unknown things that come out. And, you know, the tech industry has been extremely effective over the last 20 years of moving through this cycle again and again. And, you know, there's a version of this diagram that has the Wadley mapping, for those familiar with it, the Wadley mapping evolution along the bottom, because every time somebody or an organization gets to the scale end of this spectrum, somebody else is then going to use that scale to build something new, and the cycle continues. And the cycle not only continues, but it seems to be accelerating, because, you know, it's a linear, it's an exponential process, this. So really our job, or you know, what the OODA loop is telling us that we need to do is that we need to abstract what we know. So, you know, information and knowledge. We need to practice what we can do. That's in our kind of standard operating procedures. In the military, we'd have called that drills. And that's the kind of the small pieces. And then the skills that we extract, the skills are extracted into knowledge, and knowledge is used to refine our skills. And that's how we kind of have this growing capability. And I think, you know, in order to be able to, you know, have the leverage to even operate in today's world, it's that kind of intangible, you know, I've drawn this as a very nice defined diamond in the middle, but it's really not like that. It's an intangible understanding and fluency of operating in our environment that we're aiming to get to, and thinking of the world in this kind of very linear cause and effect way actually keeps us further away from it. You know, we're trying to, we almost make the mistake of jumping over understanding to try and get to certainty, but that certainty is slippery and it doesn't exist because the world changes too quickly. So we can talk about this in the chat. So Chris and I are still involved with this exploration. We're having some really good discussions with, you know, agile consultants, technology folks, mixed up with, you know, street cops who use this stuff day to day in a very different context, and that's been fantastic. Algorithms for Leadership is the course that I'm currently building and delivering the first cohort of at the moment, which comprises the OODA loop, situational awareness, mission command, and then some commonalities that I've observed between things like the way the military does things and, believe it or not, the way holocracy, which is a sort of decentralized command way of thinking, do things. And I think that and I've extracted those into a set of practices that I've used in teams that are pretty useful for, you know, charting the right energy pathway through this confusion. Right? It's, you don't know exactly you'll never know exactly what's going on. So it's figuring out at what point you need to stop digging and start taking action. Yeah, many of the organizations I've worked in never figure that out, and they just end up going through orient, decide, orient, decide, orient, decide, and the action never happens and the observation never happens, and they drift further and further away from reality. And that's what this practice is sort of designed to implement for them. There's a YouTube playlist which I'll make sure is available in the out brief. This is a little screenshot from the course. So it's designed, it's basically taking everything that I've talked about so far, plus a lot more detail of situational awareness, the concept of mission command, which is this kind of decentralized command that has been popular for the last sort of 50 years in military circles, but it's essentially what you need to be able to operate in chaos. In order for tech leaders to be able to move confidently through the constant change of, you know, our current situation. So I'll share a link to that. Thank you very much. You can find me on Commandodev on Twitter. That's my email address. This is a link to the course. I'm also Commandodev on LinkedIn if anyone wants to connect with me there. And yeah, that's my presentation, and let's go to conversation.
Cheers, Ben. Found that really interesting. Quite mind blowing in some ways from my little brain, anyway. But one of the things I was going to ask is, you know, in terms of like applying this, like you know, within organisations, have you taken sort of like, you know, baselines in terms of like, you know, almost like this is their current state, like, you know, and having to like gone through these various like, you know, iterations of OODA, like, you know, have you got like some sort of like, you know, empirical evidence of being able to say, right, well, this is where you were before we started like looking at it and thinking in this manner, like, and arriving at decisions and managing like, you know, uncertainty, etc. And this is how much we've moved on in becoming in a better place.
Not really. I mean, this is, you know, it's a difficult one. I mean, I think we might be veering into philosophical questions here, but you know, I think inherently, I was actually having this discussion with a bunch of academics that were trying to work with the Marines training, actually.
Yeah.
Right, to try and figure out how to keep a body of troops current, right? And that's just such a difficult question to answer, right? There's so many different things you need to unpick there, right? To what degree does individual skill determine how well a team performs, right? Can you measure how good a team is by measuring the individual skill, right? Can you say that, you know, these developers, you know, this group of developers went from making X number of bugs per release to this number of bugs per release, and that means that they're now an X amount better development team. So, you know, that there's been, obviously there's accelerate in that body of work, which I think is very good on the kind of, well, I mean, it is essentially, if you scratch away the surface a little bit, they're talking about OODA loops there, right? It's, if you operate quicker, I mean, this is the problem, right? It's not just about operating quicker. If you release stuff quicker, but your decision making is crap, and you're releasing the wrong stuff quicker, well, okay, great, you've measured that you're moving quicker, but, you know, big deal.
Yeah.
The guy that's coming behind you, who's a bit more measured and a bit more kind of strategically aware, is going to be moving maybe in slower hops. Probably not, actually. If they're more strategically aware, they probably won't be. But potentially they'll be moving in slower increments, but they'll be moving in the right direction. Now, that's not generally the way it drops out. You know, in general, if you're able enough to be moving faster and learning critically, then in general, I think you're probably moving in the right direction as well, because that's part of the learning process. But yeah, it's fair. I think this is, I mean, I'd love to know how one might measure this stuff without losing the essence of it.
Yeah. I guess taking baselines and then evaluating where you are periodically is assuming a lot of constants, right? Yeah, and that just isn't really where the field in which we operate in. But I guess it's I guess there's to a certain extent some indication of maybe heading in the right direction if you're achieving your goals of the organisation. And whilst it's loose, I think this stuff that you're looking at is probably probably quite specific. Chris has got his hand up, I think.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say very quickly, one of the things that I think is more worthy of measurement than things we usually end up measuring are vectors, which are basically looking at your journey over time rather than measurements or point-in-time metrics. They're very useful for looking at things to see where you are and for orientation, really. But they end up usually being the goal for companies rather than the things that help them achieve the goal.
Yes.
So that I would, and don't ask me for answers here, by the way, but I'm saying I would measure vectors or try to identify the vectors over time, because as the loops go, and there are multiple loops, and Ben and I've talked about this a lot, but it depends on which loops you're talking about and how long you've been doing it for and how fast they're looping and all sort of. But anyway, I thought I'd throw that into the mix just to make things, as Annie wants to chip in.
Yeah, I really like what you said there. I wasn't thinking of the word vector, but more of the process around how well is the team able to orient themselves? How are they able to check in with their actions? How are they in the loop? So their ability to be aware of what they're doing themselves and as a team in the moment is and getting better and better at that helps them to then progress with their actions to achieve the outcomes that they're after.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I just want to bring up is that I've worked and I've built really top tier development teams. Like we had this amazing kind of way of working with each other, amazing kind of internal situational awareness, really good relationships and everything else. But you throw that into the chaos of an investment bank or a startup, and I've built one in each environment. And if the startup doesn't know what strategy it's pursuing or is changing that strategy too often, it doesn't matter how good your team is. If the team you build in an investment bank is mired in the absolute garbage fire of your usual kind of big company IT department, it also doesn't matter. So it's really you could be measuring the outcomes and think, we're doing really well here, but actually from an organizational point of view, from a holistic, that kind of complex side of the graph point of view, you're still pretty screwed. And it's kind of I don't know, I feel like almost measurement is kind of reinforcing the wrong mental models for this stuff, right? It's an intuition. It's I mean, obviously that's extremely difficult to sell to leadership, and I'd welcome any any hints on that side, because I think people want certainty, and that's what I said earlier, right? You're so busy chasing certainty that you skip any kind of useful understanding sometimes.
Yeah, you kind of want the measurement to be part of the intervention, helping people to identify how they are doing in the OODA loop, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't it really the opposite of what? There's a hand up. Tony Kang. How you doing, Tony? It's been a while.
Yeah, nice to see you, Barry.
Nice
yeah, that conversation about the leadership and metrics. I've been having that conversation for a few weeks, mostly via PowerPoints, going back and forwards. That's how you have a conversation with leadership team on metrics. Anyway, today I had a good breakthrough. Got to some of the right people to discuss, and it was about ways of working. This funny thing, when you get ways of working as one of the leadership priorities, then you get all the behaviours that come with it of tell me your metrics and when you're meeting the target. So we were literally trying to just talk about the vector metrics. Say our target here is just to have continuous improvement, end of. There is no hard target for any of it. And that took a heck of a debate to get that point through. But not too long a debate, actually. They did get it. It's just a matter of having the key is just getting the introduction to the right people to be able to explain to the key people that gather the metrics, report the reports and feed them up to the leadership, make sure that everyone in that chain needs to understand what you mean, because most of this stuff is just cut and paste by PowerPoint, and that's where the loss of meaning comes, isn't it? Just meaningless metrics. Yeah,
I think it can be really tempting in uncertain circumstances for leaders to ask for everything, and that just is a recipe for them overwhelming themselves with too much detail, right? If I think here's a pattern that I've seen quite a lot actually, is that think of a startup, you're, let's say 6 to 12 people, right? Everyone's in the same loop, everyone's communicating about the same thing, everyone has this kind of shared context and shared understanding that you can maintain up to about 12 people. And then you get a bunch more teams, and the leadership still want to run the rest of those teams the same way as they were. So they're like, tell me everything. And very quickly they won't see the wood for the trees, because we don't have any kind of compression of information there, right? There's data, there's loads of data, but there's no way of building the understanding there, because there's just too much. And I think that's something that the military does actually really well, because if you have an overwhelmed leader in the military, people die. So over time they figured out that there are ways of doing this, like decentralized command, like trusting your subordinates but setting the right boundaries, all this stuff which is basically mission command. But I think in tech we're not quite at that level of maturity yet, because up until sort of probably 5-10 years ago, our mental models were all about sort of optimizing factories rather than managing uncertainty and operating in uncertainty. And I think that's why I'm excited about this stuff and why I think it's important, because like it or not, change is exponential in the tech industry, and our ability to think of systems as these kind of factories that need to be tinkered with and optimized, and machines to be improved are falling apart. And I think that's probably where a lot of the cognitive load that we experience in tech comes from.
I was just going to ask about, you mentioned speed as well, and this is one of the big misconceptions of OODA. It's also one of the biggest misconceptions of agile and agility in general, is how do we go faster? And of course, things like speed are side effects, but that's not necessarily the same for OODA loops. So I don't know how many people are into, agile and so on the call, but I suspect a few. So I didn't know if that was something you'd find interesting to mention or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard from a few people that actually the underpinnings of agile are OODA, right? The OODA loop was, Steve Blank knew of the OODA loop, and Steve Blank was the kind of the mind behind the lean startup, and a lot of this agility stuff is really kind of OODA loop with a bunch of dress up. But yeah, I mean, I remember when I was in the startup that I mentioned before, we had this amazing team, right? A small team. We were using a pretty niche programming language. The most gifted technology team that I've probably ever worked with. And the problem was not in our ability to deliver, or even our ability to deliver fast, because we were bloody good at that. The problem was that the direction kept on changing. And the problem was that was the problem. But then the CEO brought an agile coach in who'd come from a team of many programmers using different technologies, a very different mindset. And he started talking to us about story points and measuring this kind of steady state throughput. And I was like, that is, I didn't know it at the time, but it felt inherently wrong. And now I've done all this kind of exploration, I understand why it was inherently wrong, because it was trying to go for this kind of linear, steady state, flow-based model of the world when we were in a completely changeable, open to interpretation environment, and we were optimizing for completely the wrong thing.
Apologies for my look. This is Vancouver, Canada, early morning.
Thanks for joining
Thanks
us.
for joining.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I really enjoy this. Thank you very much. I just want to mention I'm leading currently 9 agile teams. And what you're talking about resonates a little bit, but we're discovering that agile is mostly about making yourself interruptible. And that's where speed comes in. Usually traditional software development teams are not interruptible, and interruption is considered evil. And you should just isolate yourself and leave them for 3 months, do their magic, don't even look in their direction. And that agile is kind of disrupting that. And we are learning the value of being steerable. Like, you should be able to steer at any moment. And to be steerable, you need to be interrupted first. Because if you're charging in a straight line, you're not steerable. You're up in the air flying, and you're confident and you're arrogant. And you're like, we know what we're doing, and leave us to do our magic. That's not the reality. And it's a very tough transition to give up your autonomy and your agency as an expert software engineer, and to be very vulnerable and very sensitive. Because I think it's all, to me, learning from nature. Nature is super fast. The feedback loops in nature are like in unthinkably fast. And I think the more closer we get to that, the more realistic or the more valuable our engineering becomes. But and that's why I really appreciate, Ben, you opening up with four like entropy, uncertainty, ambiguity, and incompleteness. And we always have to think about whatever information you have right now, you're missing a lot.
Yeah.
And be prepared the next moment to learn a radically different picture of the world. And then you act, you orient, you decide, you act. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Sorry for ranting. I'm really excited about what you guys are doing, and I'm all for it. I'm just like in love with this whole thing. And I think this makes this set of skills is applicable everywhere, and it will make us thrive and become better people.
Yeah, and actually, you've reminded me of an important concept, actually, Alex, that I didn't mention, which I will now. Is that when you're uninterruptible, you're slowly, depending on the speed of the change of the environment, you're slowly drifting away from reality, right? The only points at which the OODA loop touches reality is in observation and action, right? And if you're internally focused, tinkering away, building stuff, and not delivering anything, not shipping, you are not taking action, right? You think you are because you're building stuff, but action is the point at which you get feedback from your environment so that you can observe. And if you're not doing those things, what you're actually doing is building internal entropy. You're not building structure that is driving you to be more in tune with your environment. You are allowing entropy to build up, because any closed system that is not taking energy in or exchanging energy from outside of itself is by definition building entropy. And that's where I didn't explain that as well as I could. And your point reminded me that's actually probably the most important.
One other thing I would like to just throw in is, in my opinion, orientation is the most important point. And that's where our brilliance of being able to think out of the box, being able to think laterally. Yep. And like you say, abandoning certain things are set in stone, and opening our minds to completely reshuffle and recombine the situation. That's what differentiates victorious from the less victorious. Yep. And I think that's the skill we should cultivate, is really, and I'm pretty sure you have some exercises and people who do have some methods to, challenge you and to say, okay, let's stop here for a while and let's completely bust open everything and let's consider things from a surprising new, fresh angles.
Yep.
And that's where you come up with where you reset your opponent's OODA loop and then they're going down while you're, I'm being a bit over dramatizing because I like the military analogy, right? Where you want to stay alive, you want to stay in one piece.
Yeah, but I mean that's exactly the opposite of entropy, right? The build the instead of your structure, your internal structure breaking down, when you are exchanging energy with your environment, you're building structure up, and that structure is there solely to build intuition so that you can move quicker, so that you're more in tune with your environment. And it's I mean, Chris and I have talked about this in the context of martial arts a lot, right? The only way you do that is by practicing, consciously practicing. And the way the military does it is by matching that practicing with proper debriefing, not your 20-minute Friday afternoon agile retrospective where no one gives a shit because they're not listened to, but the proper debrief that is probably, I don't know, an order of magnitude at least more time spent on it than is commonly the case, right? Because that's where you learn, that's where you build that intuition and that structure, and that's where you get better.
Yeah, I think you had a brilliant tweet a few days ago when you asked, why do people think that people in military are just like those mindless drones when you have to be like super resourceful and you're on your own? Like, okay, your boss tells you, your sergeant tells you go and do that, but now you're on your own and you have to draw on everything you have to be able to function. So it's completely opposite of what people envision. So anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate this. This is awesome. This is just fantastic, and I'm all for it. And anything I can do to help, let me know.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Ben, I had a question. Kind of when Alex was talking about the importance of orientation, it made me think about how do you know which direction to orientate yourself in? Is there something within the way of thinking from an OODA loop perspective that helps you with that orientation? So I'm sort of picturing out on a field that you need to be able to orientate yourself to understand where you are, but then to make a decision you need something around direction. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So orientation, I think, there's lots of problematic's not really the right word, but I'll use it. There's lots of kind of problematic connotations for orientation, right? Orientation as being a direction that's a single, like, you're standing on a flat plane and you're looking around, right? So one of the things that I mentioned in one of the slides is a tiny paper that Boyd wrote. It's 8 pages long, Destruction and Creation, back in 1976. And the most fascinating thing to me about Boyd's work, but that paper in particular, is that it just so closely matches much of the research that's happening in cognition and related fields and machine learning and all these things. So really, orientation is the process of a representation I've been playing with a little bit is, you can have, let's say you've got your orientation, right? You can skim through it. Like if you're in familiar circumstances, you barely skip the surface and you've gone straight back to action because there's no surprise there. There's nothing that you need to pull apart and put back together. When, I don't know, Amazon enters your industry, or, Google changes its algorithm, or something else happens, and you've got this big, oh shit moment, that's when you actually need to go through the kind of very high energy process of pulling everything apart, looking at everything from first principles, putting it all back together again. And that's orientation, really. It's not figuring out which way to go next. It's the process of figuring out which way to go, right? It's like the meta, the higher dimensional version of looking at a compass, I suppose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
I think it has to do a little bit with expectations. And as humans, we go through life expecting certain things. And now, depending on what you expect, that's what you become. So that may also inform our process of orientation. But I don't know. That's the question. And you did answer with the context. And I think we should explore more where is the context coming from?
Yeah. I mean, the expectation point is very good, actually, because, if you're a programmer, your expectation is that you have to break things down to very concrete levels in order to be able to build it. So actually, this kind of process of thinking about all of this stuff is kind of contrary to the nature, the logical nature of a programmer, right? Because the natural extrapolation of, oh, I can break this small thing down and build it, is I can break this 6-month project down and build it, or I can break this year-long vision down and build it. And that's, that's what we see again and again. Things like OKRs, right? This is kind of bugbear of mine. OKRs are not meant to be a linear graph of everything that you want to get done in the next quarter, and you break it all down to the task level and you make this kind of amazing plan. That's bullshit. Everyone knows it's bullshit, but people still do it. Yeah. What was it? What was the quote? First let chaos reign, then reign in chaos. Right? Where is the chaos in OKRs as they're implemented most often? Completely missing.
I think that's where people are mistaking complication and complexity, where you've got order and material linear causality, and then you have complex situations where you actually can't predict the interactions. Everything you do will have unintended consequences, and that's where context becomes a lot more important. But exactly as Alex was saying, that's where you explore, that's where you change things, that's where you test everything very quickly. And it's that exaptive, adaptive, reactive kind of arena. Sorry, go on, Barry.
Okay, carry on. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I was just going to very quickly mention Ben was talking about the drills that you do and how you get into stuff. Yeah. That it's worth also understanding that, especially if you want to go back to what Alex was saying about combat, that can actually become exploited if you become too reliant on them as well. You have to have the drills there to deal with things, but be able to cognizantly look at where those drills don't apply and explore new things, because otherwise you get to use these drills for literally everything, and that can be exploited. So just thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an interesting and delicate balance between fundamentals and something totally out of the left field. For example, I'm a guitar player. I see you have a lot of guitars back there. I'm a guitar player, and the OODA loop totally applies, because I'm observing. I'm playing with the band, and I'm observing what's going on. So now I have to orient myself, and I have to kind of get the situation where I know some fundamentals and I know what the chord progression is. And then I can stick to the fundamentals and I can be safe. And my expectation is to not play a bum note. And then I can decide and play the note that I don't think it's a bum note. It's a safe note. But after a while, I realize I'm risking of losing my audience, because I'm so dull and I'm so worn out cliches that everybody's like, "Oh, this guy's like really sucks." So now I have to come up with something that's going to perk people's ears. Like, what was that? But not a mistake. So this loop is constantly going in my head, right? And to me, that's very, again, going back to context, expectations, and how they change, and how it has to be super fast. If I'm not super fast, I'll be booed off the stage. Yeah. Just one illustration of how this loop works.
Have you seen the Pixar movie Soul?
Not yet. I heard it's brilliant. I haven't seen it yet. They
call it jazzing, right? They've got this this jazz player who ends up in sort of halfway between, the afterworld. He dies and he doesn't want to go, and he's a jazz player, but he doesn't realize anything that you just said. So he's tasked with trying to help this soul be born, and he's trying to do this kind of linear. Oh, we just need to find your passion, right? We need to find, let's try basketball, let's try this, let's try that. And actually, it turns out that the jazz you find is the outcome of doing something, rather than the thing that you find to to be your passion.
But in music, speed is paramount. Good musicians are phenomenally fast. And I'm not saying fast playing fast, but fast in thinking and in orienting.
Yeah, I mean that's an outcome, something that I recognise from martial arts as well. If I'm rolling with a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, right, they could be a woman who is a quarter as strong as me and half the weight, but they think and they sense, and every single kind of action that they take is on a different plane to me. So it doesn't matter. Like that mismatch does not matter, because their OODA loop is not just faster. It's more accurate. It's quick. It's more intelligent. It's just, everything better than mine. I'm sitting here going through that very kind of deep reorientation every time they do something.
Yeah.
By which time they're 3 or 4 moves ahead, and there's no advantage that can withstand that level of difference.
And they know how to reset your loop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very, very.
And so
key,
same as with, again, I'm going back to musicians. They know how to reset the audience loop, because we think, oh, I know where you're going, and it's all worn out cliche. And bam, all of a sudden, like, wow, this was brilliant. It's something to observe, right? It's amazing. But to me, it's all about speed. At the end of the day, intelligence is speed.
Yep.
Ben, just sort of going back to something you were talking about at the start, and you put it in context. We were talking in context of scaling organisations, right?
Yeah.
How can we look at applying this in very big, monolithical, 100-year-old organisations? Is there a way of breaking it down, so you're looking at entrepreneurship and looking at it from that perspective?
Yeah, I think there is. I think that most big organisations have, in some way, kind of forgotten how to do this stuff. In some sense. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Loon Shots by 𝗦𝗘𝗢𝗠 𝗚𝗟𝗢𝗕. That's a great book because he's also a physicist. So he looks at things from this kind of algorithmic, natural sciences point of view. And it's all about networks for him. So he's talking about separating out the innovation network so that it can have a faster OODA loop. There's loads of things, if you're innovating, there's loads of things you're going to try that don't work, right? If you try and do that in the context of 6-month cycles within, your standard kind of line of business type of environment, you'll never get through that loop quick enough to catch up with the environment that's moving, right? So you have to have that fast OODA loop. You have to be able to throw a bunch of stuff away. And actually in many enterprises, being wrong is not about experimentation. It's about, oh shit, you made a mistake. But that's not what interaction with the environment is about, right? You will be wrong a lot. So I think 𝗦𝗘𝗢𝗠's point about having separate networks for innovation and then kind of some boundary spanning role to essentially downsample what they've discovered into the organization. Interestingly enough, this is exactly how the Special Operations Executive worked in the Second World War. So if you want a book about, how to innovate in a large organization, read Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Conduct, because that's exactly what they did. They didn't have, some kind of grand plan or strategy. They had a capability that they needed to build, which was, how do we disrupt the German network, right? How do we find the weak points and exploit them? And they went about that by hiring a crazy caravan builder who was an inventor who invented limpet mines, and a bunch of other similar, weirdos and misfits, to coin a phrase from recent past. And they set about just building stuff, and then they figured out how to use it. So it's completely the other way around from how direction and how resources are spent in most organizations, including actually the organization they were in, which was the Ministry of War. They wouldn't have got anywhere unless Churchill had kind of put an umbrella over them and protected them. Really, really interesting book.
Sounds a lot like what you talk about is having implicit diversity in, I would say, in a genome. Looking at it from a biological point of view, you'd have a genome and a phenome. Phenome is who you are, and then the genome is the realm of possibility. Because I think talking earlier about how nature has it really fast, that's because nature's evolved to fit its environment, and it's perfectly suited to it. So in terms of the OODA loop, it's almost like that's purely at the intuition level, because it's already evolved to suit. Whereas, if you've got those teams that are uninterruptible, they're ignoring their environment. They're failing to adapt constantly. So I think, the issue we have compared with maybe 100 years ago when people were doing time and motion studies is that everything's changing all the time.
Yeah.
And how can you possibly keep up with that? But what you need to do is orient to your environment. And if it's almost like it's not even enough to orient to the environment now, because it's going to change next week.
Yep.
So you need teams who have the ability to adapt their adaptation.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That's spot on. That is spot on. Evolution. Like I was in a course on finance a little while ago, and we were talking about what strategy is from a finance point of view, right? And strategy is how you. The definition we came up with is strategy is how you organize your resources in order to solve problems that people will pay you money for. And, in that light, the OODA loop is how you evolve that organization of resources, right? It's, evolution by natural selection is one way to do evolution, but there is also another one, which is intelligent design and natural selection. So instead of just blindly sitting in this kind of fitness function in this fitness landscape and hoping you find the local maxima, it's using your orientation to actually spot likely areas of local maximum and then shaping your evolution towards that point. I think that Mike, I think, is what you mean about learning to adapt. I think that's this kind of internal intuition that good teams have. It's not doing the thing better, it's learning how to improve towards better. It's like the second derivative integral. No, derivative.
Okay.
Yeah. Chris?
I just wanted to kind of add to that slightly in terms of the fact that there's another not issue, challenge, I would say, because in terms of evolution, I think this is probably the first time in human history where our tools are actually now evolving faster than we can keep up with. So our tools are now out evolving us, which is very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we need to employ OODA even just to be able to use the tools that we're creating to help us with other OODA loops. I think it's a very interesting meta concept.
Yeah. Mike. Sorry, I did that sort of make sense? What I said?
No, it did. I was thinking that I was just thinking about fitness landscapes, and I remember a thing called the Baldwin effect, which maybe is a similar thing with natural systems, that they can actually learn during their lifetime, which would edge that population potentially towards another fitness peak and out of a local minima potentially. I think. I don't know, it's been a while.
So there's two really good books on thinking about this kind of evolution stuff. One is The Origin of Wealth by Eric Beinhocker. And the other one is The Dragons. So that's a kind of looking at economics through the lens of evolution and natural sciences. And then the other one is The Dragons and the Snakes, which is doing the same for our defense industry and our kind of foreign policy from both the US and the UK, and that's by David Kilcullen. Both of them are super insightful, really, really interesting, and so many lessons that overlap with what we've been talking about.
Speaking about evolution, though, Ben, isn't when it's interesting that we come around to this, because isn't like what most people refer to in our industry, in terms of transformation, really, isn't it really just evolution? Transformation to me seems something like very far in the future, a step change in what we're doing now. But I think that whenever we're talking about context of transformation in terms of digital transformation or banking transformation or whatever, it is just like incremental, like evolution. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So I'm going to share a quote. I can't remember who it was, but unfortunately I can't attribute this to myself much as I'd like to. A transformation is what you need when you've fallen asleep at the wheel of evolution, right? Because you've moved so far away from where the environment is. You need to do this big bang, top down kind of, oh shit, we're lost. And, many companies just do this again and again and again. Actually, the reason that keeps happening, I think, is that the evolutionary process is bottom up and transformation is implemented or at least instigated top down. So unless you use transformation solely to be able to build a better OODA loop and be able to build this kind of evolutionary ability into your company or your organization or your team or whatever, you'll always have to keep doing it, because to Mike's point, right, you're not getting that meta learning to be better at doing the thing going. So you'll always have some, and this is why consultants love it, because you'll always have that dependency on the outside, transformation agent to come in and help you transform. Whereas you're completely right, Barry. I think the trick is learning to be an evolutionary organization so that you don't need these big bang transformations.
Hey, very interesting discussion on that. What if you took the wrong turn and it kind of hardened, and then now you realize you kind of dug yourself into some kind of a hole? Do you have any comments on that?
I mean, that sounds like a failure of orientation, right? Depending on the size of or organization that you are. Because the other thing that I think we were talking about scaling earlier, right? If you're let's take a company like Hopin. Hopin's the online events company. They went from 0 people, well, a standing start, the founding team, to a team of 350 people in a company worth more than $1 billion in about 9 months. Right. So the organizational, social communications challenges of doing that compared to the challenges of growing a company to that size over 20 years, which probably would have been the norm, 10 years ago, they're almost incalculable, right? You'd have to have that ability to evolve your systems and your communications, because there's absolutely zero way you can run a 300-person organization in the same way you would run the founding team. So if companies are getting into dead ends, or, what we're saying when the company's in a dead end is either they've lost the ability to adapt and the environment's changed, or they've just gone down this kind of road of down a wrong direction, right? They've lost their kind of place in the fitness landscape. Both of those things indicate that they are not able to adapt to changes in the fitness in their environment fast enough. And that's it, right? It's either you evolve such that you can still take energy in from outside in the form of money, or money in economic terms, and build your internal structure. And if you can't do that anymore, your company dies. Or you can do that and you are still viable. And that is the binary 2 options: viable, not viable.
I'll give you one example, if I may, and I'm sorry to hog so much of it. I'm a software engineer, and I really like studying the history of computing. And collectively, at one point back, I don't know exactly, let's say 60 years ago, we made this decision to develop software using code as text. We're now learning that this was the worst possible decision, because code as text is just terrible. I make a diff, and it takes forever until I see whether this diff even... I'm waiting for the feedback for the excruciatingly long time. Mm-hmm. It's and that's why in software industry is such a terrible shape today, because we are not getting feedback. We are making all kinds of changes, and we are learning sometimes days, weeks later whether our change. So it's just not tenable, not feasible. And so that's what I'm talking about. We dug ourselves into a hole as a humanity, where we are, and on one end, On one hand, we are basing our entire life survival on software. On the other hand, we have this terrible approach to building software, which is super low quality and which is like filling in the dark. You just touch. So we do need transformation. We do need to find a better, more human, more effective way of building software, because text is not it. Computers don't understand text. They need a lot of song and dance and babysitting, you know that, before they actually enact what you actually told them. And, we need to find a way really to fundamentally transform this, because we are seeing that the edge computing and IoT software will be running our lives. Every man-made object, will be running software. We need to be very careful how we go about that, because the current arrangement, I'm very concerned. This is my profession. This is my life. I think it's really in terrible shape. And that's why I'm so big on telling people to inform themselves about OODA loop, inform themselves about the importance of speed of the feedback, immediacy of the feedback. And that's why I'm so enthused about what you guys are doing. And I think we should really make it more mainstream and realize the fact that we need to get away from this really primitive way of building software. Anyway, that's my rant today.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because, if we consider like the software industry as an OODA loop, right? What you're saying is that there is no path to incremental improvement there, because we made such a fundamental mistake that's been built upon for so long. We've got this kind of, I don't know, like the appendix in our body, right? It doesn't perform any use, but it's still there and can still kind of flare up and kill us every now and again.
Yeah. So
what you're really saying there is that, you need to really tear down the whole thing. They do this super high energy kind of rethinking of how we do stuff. And that probably, to go back to Chris's point about our tools developing faster than we are able to manage, right? If you need to tear everything down and start from scratch, even if you're building a lot quicker because you've chosen the right abstractions, it's still going to take you a hell of a long time to catch up.
Yeah.
When the world's moving away from you exponentially, you need to be able to move, exponentially as well in order to catch up. So it's the energy or resources involved in doing that kind of rethinking of a field. Like, a company that's a certain size is realistically not able to reinvent itself. And all that will happen is it will get cannibalized.
I'd quite just like to challenge that a little bit, Ben, in terms of but there's a model out there, which is kind of like built around. I think it was Barry O'Reilly talks about in his book Lean Enterprise, where he talks about exploit, sustain, and retire. So the basic gist of that I'm getting at is that we rarely look at, you think about retiring, and with technology, the way it's like things change so quickly, that you look at your iPhone, that's you look at where that's come in 10 years, but we still, especially in financial services, we inherently have got a bad record of retiring and starting from scratch. Whereas if you look at and if you look at these new startups, if you like Starling and Monzo, and compare what they've been able to do in such a relatively short amount of time compared to these big financial institutions, there's a proven kind of record there of people building from scratch and being able to outdo these incumbents. And you can look at Starling have taken on payment services for these organisations which have been around for decades. So they've got better at what they're doing. They're better at it already. So it's. I think there is. My point is, I think that sometimes it pays to start again.
Yeah, totally. In fact, so that's a really interesting example. I remember I was working at a bank when Monzo first came on the scene, and one of the sort of senior tech directors who probably wasn't very technical, but had time in the game. He shared a blog post about how Monzo does experimentation. I was like, how can we do this here? And I went through and I looked at all of the individual technologies, Kafka and cloud and all this stuff, right? All of it was available in some form in the bank. But the problem is, to get even the environment you would need to be able to do the experiment in the bank would take you 6 months, right? So the other observation is that you could have taken that incredibly productive Monzo team, or an individual from that incredibly productive Monzo team, and parachuted them into the bank, and their productivity would have been decimated. Likewise, you could have taken somebody who couldn't get anything done in the bank and parachuted them into Monzo, and they probably would have been really effective straight away. And on Starling, I read a really interesting InfoQ article from two of their kind of VP of engineering, I think, and about how they go about building their technology. And they have built the core of Monzo out of the ashes of the frustration of their time in financial services, right? So I think the point still stands that the vast majority of companies, incumbent companies, just have no ability to be able to do this, right? There's just no path for them. They can pay Deloitte and Accenture and McKinsey all of the money, and they still won't be able to do it, because there's just this kind of, their fitness landscape has some kind of massive, great big thing that they can't get over.
It's like blockbuster Netflix situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, this comes down to really sort of how you bring people into the organisation, favouring people's ability to and training people to be able to adapt, rather than train them into a specific technology skill.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess like the problem with the big banks and other big companies is that the transformation that you would need to be able to operate and compete with the likes of Starling and Monzo requires a top to bottom rethinking of how everything works, right? From the way people are rewarded, to the way people are led, to everything. And it's just not feasible for them to be able to do that. I just don't think, there are a couple of companies, I think, there's a big insurance company that's managed to do it, but that would take a visionary leader who has absolute control, absolute trust from the board, and is basically entrenched for years and years. And it also takes that person to realize that they need to ignite an insurgency bottom up to meet them in the middle. And I mean, the number of leaders who can do that are vanishingly small.
I mean, if you just strip it back to something that's fairly basic in terms of you're looking at whether these organisations are truly learning organisations, and do they embrace that as part of as part of moving forward? Is learning part of your job, or is it like you do this after work, you do it in your own time? We're going to give you very limited money to do it.
Yeah. Do you deliver your learning on the same platform as your compliance training that you make people sit through with a gun to their head every 6 months?
True.
If the answer is yes, good luck, because you're screwed.
Mike, have you got your hand up by you from last time? You've been patiently waiting to say something.
I didn't realise it stayed up, but it does remind me. I'm not sure I've done my GDPR training. Must do that.
Okay. Is there any other questions? I thought that's definitely the most engaging Q&A session I think I've had for a very long time. So I really appreciate everyone getting involved in that. It's really good.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been a great discussion.
Can I just add something of your discussion? For me, one of the biggest, I'm an agile coach, and one of the biggest challenges in big organization is the black box of investment. Companies are investing enormous amount of money, but they don't understand that nothing is being delivered. So I think the board thinks, wow, we are investing all this money in technology. And in reality, the competitiveness of the company doesn't change. And the leadership that you mentioned before. I think combination of those two are providing impossible situation to change, would be my view.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think, the vast majority of boards don't understand, there's a problem with leadership that, if you were current 20 years ago, right, your mental models about the art of the possible with technology are way out of date. I mean, I had to re-examine my mental models about what's possible with technology about 6 months ago when I started building some stuff with some new kit that was available, right? And that was for a small client, very little. There was greenfield. It was easy to experiment with. But, if you're a big company and you've got, like, let's say your CTO was current when, building stuff with big teams of Java programmers was the way you got stuff done, and you bought all your servers and all this stuff, right? And you haven't been able to stay current because the pressures of your job are such that you've been, busy with other things. It's no wonder that all the money's being, incinerated rather than invested, right?
I honestly think that they don't understand how little they get for their money. So
Totally.
Part of organization, I always give example, if a part of the organization invests 10 million, very, very few of the organization actually get more than $1 million return on investment. And they just don't understand how quickly they're burning so much money. And I think in 3-4 years, this will be not sustainable. Because to be honest, I haven't gone to a bigger company. I'm talking multinational company. They're actually not burning funding. And they're really investing, and they're really keeping up to date with technology and everything. But I think it's 1 to 10, the return on investment they get at the moment, if so. So scary.
I wouldn't be surprised. And actually, like, to go back to our conversation about entropy before, right? If you're spending X and you're getting less than X back, you're in a downward spiral, whether you like it or not, because your competitors are spending X and getting something times X back. I mean, there's only one way that can end. No matter what your starting conditions are, if that continues, there is, one competitor is having exponential growth and the other competitor is having exponential decline. There's only one way that ends.
There's a feedback loop reinforcing those behaviour reports, which is that as an individual, you're rewarded for your fiefdom. So,
yep.
I just went through an interview process, and part of the feedback was, you haven't line managed big enough team. The feedback, so cross-functional leadership wasn't evaluated. Just how big was your fiefdom?
Wow.
So that
dodged the bullet there.
Well, then it's funny, I got the job, and they valued cross-functional leadership verbally, just not financially. So, funny situation. But that's ubiquitous, isn't it? In all large companies, not even in certain industries. So there's another part of the problem. The other part of the problem that incentivises that size situation is consultancy, because consultancies they're paid to body shop, so no matter, even if it's fixed price, it's still a body shop gig. So that's the size of the piece. So where on earth is the incentive for that to minimise the size of the team? So we've got quite a few pressures in the system there that are forcing scale that creates the self-fulfilling complexity.
Yeah. I mean, it's a wicked problem to unpick, and I don't see anyone or any company that I've seen feeding into these big organisations or government departments that even have the right mental models for this. And arguably, the right mental models for them are, we make money, so they're doing very well, thank you very much. But none of it that I've seen fills me with any kind of optimism that these companies have a way of solving this problem.
I have one more comparison. One is that all these companies are working with teams that they're like in Football League 14, but they're trying to be Premium League. So when you look at the teams and the organization, how quickly they change, and they never train the teams, but then they're trying to achieve Premium League results, which are impossible. And for me, this is one of the biggest problems. They keep shuffling teams, shuffling people, shuffling capabilities, and then they're expecting that those teams will be flexible and will be nimble and will be productive, which League 14, you need to pay £5 to be part of the fund.
Yep. Well, they're not even teams, are they, either, really, if they're continually shuffling people around and there's no supporting. Like in the military, you can shuffle people around, right? You can shuffle people into different teams because there is a structure that underlies that, because there is a shared context and a shared understanding.
Yeah, but how long do you take training before you can shuffle people so they know exactly?
Exactly.
And the thing is that what's happening in the big organization, that you get offshoring team with the team and they move around, but no one has spent even 2 days of training.
Yep.
So how can you achieve that? So for me, those two words are completely you can't compare them.
Yep.
Impossible.
Biljana, I think that's a really good segue into like something that is I've got planned coming up in July. So in July, I've organised an Enterprise Agility Month where I've got for 4 weeks. I've got each week has got a different theme, and on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays we're having sort of a session each day. The first week is going to be leadership and strategy. Second week is going to be teams. Third is people, and the fourth is delivery. And regarding teams and what we were talking about there, one of the sessions is it involves a lady called 𝗦𝗘𝗢𝗕𝗓, who's the author of a book called Dynamic Reteaming, and which is really, really interesting book. If you haven't read it, we're going to be covering the concepts. But then there's a guy. I think it's Chris Smith, head of product engineering for Redgate. He's going to be doing a experience report of how they use reteaming Redgate software. So that'd be really useful, I think. So I'll send out more details of that over the coming days. The agenda is going to be announced. Well, the agenda is getting up there over the next few days. It'll definitely be fully complete on Monday. We've got other people like Matt Skelton that's going to be involved, a guy behind Team Topologies, people like Andrew Clay Schaefer, who's one of the pioneers of DevOps, if you like, now works with Red Hat. We've got Emily Webber, who's really big on communities of practice, and we got Gabriel Benefield, who's founder of this company called Mobius Loop, which is got experience reports of that. There's a whole host of brilliant people talking there. So I'll send you details of that. But just like to say thanks again to Ben and for presenting and you facilitating this conversation. I really enjoyed it. It's definitely been one of the most interesting sort of kind of engagements with the participants here. So thanks to everyone. Thanks, Alex, for getting up early.
A pleasure.
So really appreciate it. This is going to be recorded. This is recorded anyway. So this will go up on my YouTube channel. I'll send you a link to it. Subscribe to that. There's a lot of good content on there as well as this. And just check it out. But thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Enjoy the rest of your day.